Good afternoon. Hope you're good. Hope you can hear me. Usual paranoia from me, especially because I'm coming at you from home. As of straight after this show, I'm stripping out my kitchen and bravely weighing in to fit in a new one next week because I got completely overquoted on a new one and I fancy doing it myself. So that's what I'm doing in my annual leave next week. So you won't be getting Chewing It Over from me next week, barring Tuesday. And instead, I'll be joining you the week after. Now, that means that signal might be a little bit ropey, and you've got to let me know if so, and I can flick over to a different router. But similarly, how's my sound doing? Can you hear okay? As usual, I need to put my little filter on. This is Chewing It Over, 12:30 till 1 o'clock on weekdays, and I'm Jack Chew, and got a returning guest, regular, my co-host on many a show, friend and colleague and increasing mentor, Joe Turner, joining me to talk a little bit about a conclusion of a week of shows of which have had a common theme. It was International Women's Day on Monday, and we've had therefore a set of shows in which the subject of gender, particularly in MSK with Lucy Macdonald, and then in where MSK meets sport with Ellie Summers yesterday. And lots of conversations on social media, independent of the show, have been around these sorts of issues. And so I thought me and Joe would try and bring that to, never to a close, just add into it more than anything, but talking a little bit about some of these issues, especially under the title of who are we to talk about sexism and who should be opting in and out of those conversations. So thank you for joining us. And again, do let me know, again, both in terms of signal level and sound level as to whether or not you can hear okay, because there's something different about me coming from home and it rarely goes well, so I might have to flick onto a different router. But hopefully, if I can bring in Joe Turner. Joe, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
And is it working all right? Is it glitching or?
Looks good to me so far, and I haven't seen any comments to the contrary.
Okay,
yeah,
good. Okay, well let's crack on and proceed as if it's working, and I'll flick over if needs be. So we've had a brief chat about this intermittently through the week, haven't we? Partly me seeking your counsel, nervous on this topic sometimes, as nervous as I get anyway. And so how's your week been? How are you feeling about it, and how do you feel the shows have gone?
I've really enjoyed the shows, and really want to thank Lucy and Ellie for coming on and bravely, I think, starting this conversation with you, or continuing it. And how's my week gone? Really interesting. So I have been getting increasingly angry as the week's gone on, and that really surprised me because I wasn't angry when you and I first started talking about this at the beginning of the week.
Right.
And I think I suggested the title of this session to you, Jack, early in the week.
Yeah.
And my thoughts on that title have changed as the time's gone on. So when I suggested it, I genuinely felt, who am I to talk about sexism as a privileged white woman who hasn't suffered from overt sexism? And then I started to think about just that last sentence, because I've started a few posts this week almost as a caveat. I'm writing this as a woman who hasn't suffered overt sexism. Now, if I'm being kind to myself, that's to qualify that I'm not trying to come from a place where I truly have personal experience of this. But there's just a little bit of discomfort in me that, in saying that, am I trying to distance myself from the conversation? And as the week's gone on, and I've heard from Lucy and I've heard from Ellie, and because of them, I've gone away and read more stuff. And because of some things that have come out in the news this week, not least the number of domestic violence and killings that have gone, women that have been killed during the pandemic, I've started to get really angry, not just with the situation, but with myself, because I think part of it is that I have been avoiding some of these conversations because sometimes it seems partly too exhausting, but more seriously, too scary to enter these conversations because it feels like walking into a landmine. And you feel like you're going to trip yourself up at every stage. You're going to offend someone because you can't possibly put yourself in the shoes of every woman and every man in this situation. But I hope I can be coherent today, but I suppose I'm in a slightly sort of, stuff it mood. I'm going to come on, I'm going to talk. And to everybody listening, if I say anything poorly thought out and offensive, I apologize in advance. But I think I think I'm more angry that I haven't spoken more.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. Now, there are a few forces at play that might have influenced that. Just to clarify as well, Joe said there, I wasn't particularly angry when we started the week before we started talking. I haven't riled her up. I haven't made her angry in conversation. I don't think that's what she's meaning. Time passing and her own reflections have done that. But also, it's been, on the flip side, a bit more therapeutic, I guess, for me, having engaged with some of these conversations and them somewhat going better than I anticipated. Not least because the ladies you've just described were brilliant and thoughtful, and we were appropriately careful and respectful in those conversations. But similarly, I've admitted in both those shows and said that this is there are tripwires, minefield, that sort of thing that you're describing, whereby it does feel like something that, compared to most topics that you would think would be more contentious, that I don't shy away from and at a moment's notice will jump and chew over. This one has been tricky and has been complex and will continue to be. And some of that I understand, but then some of it I think is definitely counterproductive. I think that the fact that it's got a bit of toxicity around it and that we can't then have mature and adult conversations, often on talking points of which so many people agree with. The amount of private messages I've had to that effect, when normally on this show, regardless of what the topic is, 90% of the messages are public. And that people that feel that they would then post on the comments and send a tweet or whatever it might be. Yet on this, I'd say 70% of the messages I've had in terms of feedback have been private. People are self-censoring in that direction. And if even I feel those forces, gobshite as I am, and you, whilst I won't call you a gobshite, certainly someone that's fairly proud and vocal and is thoughtful on this and many other issues with regards to that, and now has an increasing platform to share them. If me and you have been cautious in that direction, that just sort of fascinates me how there is a chilling effect on an important conversation. Now, when I say there are forces at play, what do you think they are, and how might we try to overcome them?
What are the forces at play? Pride is huge, I think. This isn't a topic that you want to get wrong, and it reminds me of the Black Lives Matter era as well, where loads of us just clammed up because we just felt, it seems like there's so big a chance of me saying something really crass and offensive that I'm going to shy away from it. So pride. I guess one of the reflections I've had is that so much of it is so subtle and so nuanced that sometimes it takes a long time to work out what you personally think about a situation. So I want to caveat this not just against the backdrop of the atrocities that we don't have time to discuss on a half-hour show. So let's be honest, the atrocities that women suffer in certain places around the world are the backdrop of this. And we are talking about our scenario here in this country today. But in this country, in our privileged society, I also want to acknowledge that in my experience, the vast majority of men want the same for me as I want for myself. So this isn't, I think there's a danger that you feel that you're going into a situation where you're criticizing all men, and that's what it will sound like. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to follow my own thought processes here. But there's also, as a woman, I think you're hyper aware of all the women that fought for the position you're in today. And for me, it's such a risk of feeling like I'm letting the sisterhood down. And I am extremely grateful to all those women who, some of them gave their lives for where I am now. And I'm also actually grateful for the women that had to go before my generation in politics and in business. And frankly, I think they had to play a different game than I'm allowed to play now. I remember my husband actually showed me an article interviewing Jacinda Ardern this week, and she was saying how grateful she was to the female Australian and New Zealand prime ministers that have gone before, because she recognised that they couldn't play the way she does as this kind of collaborative seeking counsel role. They had to be much more strident and perhaps play more of a game that didn't feel so natural to them as women, but they paved the way for her to be the way she is now. But I think, to answer your question, one of those forces at play is, who am I letting down by saying the wrong thing?
I see what you mean. Now, one of the things that I think has been interesting in our off-air conversation, as well as has come up here, is that You've mentioned there that the vast majority of men would want what is in your best interest and therefore your own self-interest. And that's contentious from what I can tell. From feeling the water and trying to understand this, that I think is where me and you sometimes, because I'm in agreement with you on it, but I just feel like that I think is contentious. So I've been concerned about the failure of empathy that we seem to be able to apply, well, it's an inference as if we can't. So as therapists, we're in a situation where we needn't have had cancer to help someone through their cancer. We don't necessarily need to have had that direct lived experience to be able to professionally understand and emote and empathize appropriately, and to therefore help someone with that. And that is being challenged as soon as you then put that through a gendered, sexuality or race related lens on these identity issues, as if to infer that direct experience with what is being described you can't even get close to it through listening, and therefore discussing and potentially disagreeing on those issues. And that for me, I struggle to understand as to why is there such a low ceiling on empathy there, because that seems to be really counter to what I think is productive conversation. Now, this has certainly not occurred this week, by the way, and that's one of the things that's been promising. Maybe that's a shadow I'm chasing, and I'm worried about something that shouldn't be. But then I struggle to personally comprehend a gender binary in society that would involve a power structure that is often inferred, whereby, because some of the most important people in my life, the majority of the most important people in my life are women, the fact that I wouldn't be acting not just in my own self-interest or their self-interest, but also to infer that I would act on behalf of men I don't know, or even subconsciously or implicitly try to shape the world in a way that would suit men ahead of my loved females, that for me is a nonsense. Like, I just can't, and I don't just mean in a personal sense, I mean as if to suggest that men would act in male self-interest, explicitly or implicitly, ahead of their female loved ones. That's why this concept of that being like a true power struggle between genders, we are so interlinked, and rightly so, and in love with each other in such, both intimate and non-intimate ways. We're so involved together in a melting pot that just seems like such a nonsense that I struggle to really comprehend. Yet a large part of this analysis, especially for those that are critical of some of the stuff that I've said on this now and in the past, has been about that's naive somehow, but then don't offer something that helps me to even comprehend where it's wrong. Is there anything in that, because I don't want to bandwagon you on all those opinions, but I just wondered, is there anything in there that you agree, disagree with, or want to, or try and maybe help me to understand?
Yeah, no, and I really understand that thought as a man. Well, not as a man. I understand why you as a man would feel that way, and those thoughts came into my head during the Me Too movement. And I listened to lots of broadcasts on the radio. And one thing that made me uncomfortable was that there seemed to be a message that, quite rightly, this is the time for women to speak out and to actually own and talk about what had happened to them. But then there was also a subtext of men, shut up. This is our moment. Even men that, are on our side. This isn't your time to talk. Me Too means just us. And I'm really sorry if this is a moment where I let some of female groups down, but that didn't feel comfortable to me, and it felt like we were about to head off on another little path that would keep us separate, or even make us more separate than before from the men that we love, who are the vast majority, as you say. And so I do get that. And as a strong female who wants to champion women, alongside that for me is always, where are the men on this? And not patronizingly bring the men with us, but what are the men developing? How are they evolving? Who are they going to be alongside us as we evolve? And how do we work? What can we create together? I would never want to suggest that women can tell men where they need to be any more than the other way around, but to not have an awareness of each other and how we are all evolving, not just women, I think will delay progress even further. Does that make any sense?
No, it does. I think I mean, I agree in full with that and wouldn't really have anything to add. So I think we can move on to another adjacent thing. But that is something that, despite it making a lot of sense to both of us, why then is it contentious, or is it not? You know, is it a paper tiger? Like, that's the thing that fascinates me, because I think that, and it's come up a little bit in the week, is that there's this often there's the how ominous is a male force, often described as the patriarchy. How much does that embody a cabal of men, both explicitly and implicitly, creating a world in which male self-interest is furthered, often at the expense of women? And I can completely comprehend, on a context-specific level, those things happening. I can certainly look back over history and understand how that's occurring. But the intermingling, I think, is particularly interesting. But then also, I then noticed that alongside that challenge, there's also this notion where, when I bring up something where there's complex biopsychosocial reasons, of which there are relevant differences on each of those variables and everything in between men and women as a mean, far more overlap than there is distinction, but sometimes the distinctions matter. The inference that there's a relevance to biological difference, people then rush to say, as if it's biologically essentialist, as if I'm suggesting we're determined by that, and therefore the sort of archetypal differences are everything I'm on about. Whereas I'm not. It's kind of the something I raised with Ellie yesterday, is that, you know, the strength differential on the mean between men and women will affect your sociology with regards to how safety-related vulnerability issues occur when you're in isolation amongst a group, or maybe it's potentially being exposed to a group of the other sex. Like, that for me isn't biologically essentialist. It's something that essentially then is a biopsychosocial feature that affects a difference in behaviors. And surely that's okay. But even admittedly bringing those things up is something that is that's messier to me, but it's also more accurate. I'm bothered about accuracy. Whereas I could be quite popular and get a fair few cheerleaders if I was to just infer that the only conversation in this direction needs to be about male on female sexism and both overt and covert discrimination or systemic factors. Mentioning what, as I did, some people are accusing it as being obscurantist. And I wonder if, you know, have you experienced some of that, or do you feel some of those forces?
Yeah, and I think I've been through, you know, going from a teenage woman to an older woman. I've changed my view on that a little bit. And I think, you know, my teenage self would have been much more offended by the biological inference than I am now, because I've been through a lot of biological changes. You know, I have been a mother. I have cycled for years on end, and I am heading towards the other bit now as well that we can't deny happens as women and influences our lives hugely. I think women are nervous that biology is going to be used as a very easy way to push them out of things,
right?
Because it's undeniable. But can we reframe that as women? So let's not be silly. We cannot deny that biologically we are different. Women have to have babies, and it's probably best that women are with those babies during certainly the first few months of their lives. You were talking yesterday with Ellie about systems being set up to allow women to work in pro sport, and I heard you talking about the obvious problems with traveling with teams that are going to be going to make it really difficult if you are going to have a baby and need to stay at home with the baby. So as an employer, big controversial statement here, I can see the other side. So I can see that, particularly as the owner of a small business, when you've got women working for you who are of childbearing age, and there is going to be a gap that you're going to have to manage with loads of elephants in the room. So you're going to have to try and fill that space in your business for a period of time where you can't give the person filling that space any guarantee of continued work. The woman going off, if she's in self-employed status, which an awful lot of physios are, she doesn't have a guarantee of income while she's off. So she and her family have got to make the decision to accept that. So, this parity has got to come from the top level, where women and families of young children are supported, and possibly so is the employer, so that there is no decision to be made, because obviously the male and the female are equally capable of doing that job. But you've got to make the playing field level for that decision making to be not based on gender. And I guess the bit that I have moved to much more recently is that there's a lot of feminine biology which is subdued. So I think a lot of our femaleness is seen as something to be managed, particularly periods. From the day your periods start, I think you take on the message that they are to be managed and kept quiet, and heaven forbid that they might interrupt your routine and your ability to function at a high level, at the same level all the time. And what I've learned is to give myself permission to go with those natural cycles, to celebrate them, to try and work with them, and to understand that they are part of me as a woman, and that there are an awful lot of things that I'm so proud of, part of which are more on the social side of things of being a woman. And I feel these days much more ready to celebrate that in myself and in other women, and not try and subdue it and make it a problem, so that then I can just function as a man, for want of a better way of expressing it.
That's a really interesting point, because I think it's something that I've noticed, where done badly, what looks like on superficial advocacy work ends up neutralizing and losing some of the interesting edge that is worth celebrating of either gender. But in this instance, certainly, the incredible nature of womanhood on this instance, you're using biological examples, but also that seems to me to map onto the sociological variables with regards to, imagine, I mean, thankfully this isn't the case, but imagine I had carte blanche chance to reform the health system. Say my arguments cut through in the next 10 years, as I hope they maybe do, and I had some influence there. And obviously that would be me and a team, a predominantly female team, of which have become a bit of a battering ram on these issues. But let's just say that then, would I be, when I'm thinking about healthcare policy, would I be acting implicitly or explicitly to then shape systems that would be self-serving for my gender? Would it be more likely that I'd be particularly bothered about the healthcare of menopausal women because my mother and close friends are one, including close colleagues such as yourself? Why would that not factor in to both my explicit and implicit reasoning? Also, why would I be wanting to deny the lived realities of my best friends and wife, say, on cyclical issues that might affect their energy levels, that if which dismissed would be tested, that would be really clumsy behavior management, right? But also, what feels a particularly funny thing for me is that when we're starting to recognize those things, if the inference is that by me mentioning them or you mentioning them, that actually what we're harking back to is dismissing women due to hysteria, right? As if to suggest that a mention of hormonal factors in whatever which way, or some of the more biological essentialism that comes around childbirth, child rearing, child care in early stage, breastfeeding, for example, the raising of those issues is nothing other than obscurantism to hark us back to Victorian style bigotry. It's just so immature. Like, if we had to do that, compared to the rich conversations that we have about everything else, from knee pain to health policy to business management that we have on this show, it's one of the most important topics, yet we have this ridiculously childlike conversation, this really unilateral analysis, and that is bizarre. And it's probably taken for this week. I think both of us have been on this funny journey where it's almost taken for this week for us to say, what are we doing? Let's grow up a bit.
Yeah. No, and the phrase that's going through my head as you're talking, Jack, and imagining you and me developing this health system, no one needs to fear the rise of women, not men, not other women. It can only be a good thing to benefit us all.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, that done right, of course, but that tide rises all ships, surely. Like, and also, and Kath Piper, I mean, so I've realised the time, and forgive me those that are listening live and commenting, etc. I've just closed that off so me and Joe could get stuck into this important and serious topic. So I'm sorry to have ignored that, but I'll ask a question of you. Please do. We've got a few minutes now. Please, we'd love to get your comments and questions as we can come to them, especially because that might then bear out of it future episodes. But Kath has said, Joe, you have again eloquently expressed my concerns regarding the Me Too movement. I can't separate the sexes so easily and struggle with this. So both you and Kath there have felt that you noticed that was a bit of a subtext to it, because I think in its purest form initially, the hashtag Me Too was a sort of a watershed moment of people sharing their experiences. But then you and others have noticed, you, Kath, and others have noticed that felt also to have this chilling effect on conversation between the genders. And this is a time to listen. Shut up, no uterus, no opinion is something that you can imagine. I'm not good at keeping quiet ever, so didn't. But yeah, no uterus, no opinion, no womb, no words. That was another one.
Oh, I haven't heard that one.
I know, yeah, new. But yeah, just a little more on that, if you could, for me, as to, it's not just me and you saying it on a show like this and then that's all right, everyone won't. It's going to be something that it takes for people to have to put their head above the parapet a little bit, wouldn't it?
Well, I hope this isn't taking it down to too trivial level, but I'm minded of a conversation you and I had about periods a couple of weeks ago. I've been talking to Jack a lot about periods. I'd like everyone to know. I'm sure the world needs to know that. But Jack, I remember saying you made some comment about women getting annoyed when men suggest that their mood might be a certain way at a certain time in the month. And I said to you at the time, haha, yes, we're allowed to say it, but you're not. And I thought about that afterwards, and I thought, personally, I don't actually mind. And my husband doesn't actually say that to me, but if he did, would I mind? In fact, if Ian did say it to me, because of the man he is, I would imagine it would be coming from a point of, Joe, I can see you're really upset. Do we need to take what you're saying 100% at face value at the moment, or are you feeling a little bit more sensitive about this issue that, just because he would want to support me and not allow me to go off and tear strips off someone in a way that I, might really regret off. It would be for my own best interest. And, I know that's totally different to being in the office. Is she on the blob at the moment? That's totally different. Yeah. But coming from the right man in the right way, I don't have a problem with it.
Well, I mean, it's so interesting because, of course, if ever context mattered, these things do, because the exact same utterance from in a different context is compassionate and thoughtful, or utter misogynistic nonsense, isn't it? Like in the wrong context, and it could be the same words. You coming on would be something that could be the same phrase, even uttered in the same tone. In a different context, there's everything about that polarity. Now, in what was interesting about the tale I was telling was listening to a podcast years ago with Lisa Feldman Barrett, who mentioned the fact that her husband had done that. It's funny because Charlotte, by no means flawless, but also doesn't have typically cyclical mood fluctuations that you'd notice based on her cycle, interestingly. But certainly Lisa Feldman Barrett was mentioning, she's a cognitive neuroscientist, and she mentioned that her husband of many years had said, she was angry at him for something, and he said, are you coming on? And she was mortified, like, how dare he? That's amazing that he'd do that. He's never done that before. And then lo and behold, she did the next day. And he was just basically saying, well, this is a good time for us to make major life decisions here. You seem to be not at your very best here. And so she wasn't for a second suggesting that therefore that should be the way that people should see the world. But she was also just saying that, sometimes these features are in play and the context matters. And if we were to paint with such a broad brush as to suggest that all those conversations should be off the table all the time, and that therefore the notion that variability will affect sometimes mood and behavior is something that will deny us, especially she was saying as scientists, and it sounds like that's where we are really, is that it's going to be a really shallow analysis if we can't at least find a way to articulate that amongst ourselves. And the other examples that extend into menopause are another one, and it came up on the pelvic health show at the weekend. There were so many times that was brought up, and it's just like, none of these proposed actions that these are brilliant and incredible thinkers in their own fields are proposing can occur unless the conversation matures. And that was devastating, because when we've run shows before on sport, on MSK, on all things from knee pain to service design, you can see that the actions can be quite complex and challenging, and maybe sometimes even politically, a bold call. But the conversation's rich, and it's like, that's not where the problem is, right? The barrier to actually changing things isn't because we're not able to talk about it. Whereas some of the suggestions that were being made, which were totally sensible actions that could be taken, there's a massive gap between them being suggested and being enacted, because the conversation's just poor for some of the reasons we've kind of talked about. And that, as conversationalists and as broadcasters, as we're trying to do to try and move the needle even slightly amongst the small audience we have on this show, of course, larger audiences adjacent to us with Physio Matters and Therapy Live, etc., and growing even with our sub-disciplines. But I just think that, like, we are complicit if we don't find a way to talk about this. And so between the two of us, it felt smart for us to jump on the show and at least muddle through this together. And I hope those listening have got something from that. Although, admittedly, me and Joe know that this is part conversation, part therapy for me and her to sort of broadcast some of this and shoot the shit a little bit and try and understand where we're both at with it, which is always a moving picture, isn't it? How do you feel about? Do you have any sort of hot takes as to how you'd like things to progress on this topic and all the adjacent ones?
Well, I think we should. I agree with you that there's so much, to use one of your favourite phrases, low-hanging fruit in this debate. And excuse my language, but there is twattish behaviour that goes on that just needs to be called out as that. We don't need to spend ages talking about that, because collectively we can all agree that that kind of idiocy is probably just, those people, it probably manifests in their life in all sorts of other ways. Sexism is just one manifestation of their idiocy. So I would be disappointed if we spent too long on that kind of tit for tat type stuff.
Right.
I think there's a lot, I need to go away and do a lot more inner work and examine those nuances of the things I say and the things I don't say. As women, we need to raise each other up and listen to each other and give each other more platforms, but also alongside thoughtful men as well. I would love to see many more conversations like this between other men and women, not just you and me. And a final thing about healthcare, actually, fundamentally, in a very pragmatic level, we need to deal with this, because in a workplace where sexism is going on, or bullying is going on, or racism is going on and not being called out, patient care suffers, because to be in those environments and to feel the stress, even if it's not happening to you, of that going on and not being called out is awful. And that affects a whole team, and patients will suffer because you'll be distracted by that rubbish going on. And so I think, specifically as healthcare professionals, that's a really important take-home message.
For sure. No, absolutely. It's a lovely way for us to wrap up. Thank you, Kath, as well, for another great comment. She said that the delicacy of the conversation is such that it makes us mute, and you can imagine that the last thing that I want ever is less talking, and I don't just mean me, of course, there. I think one thing just as well, which is one that I think I'd like to raise, is that for any of any blokes that might be listening that do disagree with me and Joe and anyone else on this, of either flavour, right? If they think that even what we're talking about hypes this up, or there's certainly a portion of blokes that I've spoken to about it that feel that I'm on the wrong side of this argument, but when I hear them, I can't help but find them super condescending, like just the fragile flower of a stereotypical women that they sometimes describe to me.
Bring them on.
I just find that fascinating, because they kind of inferring that women are inherently every woman based on just them being a woman, without a description of exactly who it is they're talking about, is a beleaguered minority that needs this care and compassion of a man to just hand over opportunity to. And it's just like that for me is just like that is, there's nothing progressive about that to me. That just seems bizarre. So that's me just inviting those conversations as well, in the spirit of the title of this that Joe suggested, and of course I'm into, is the idea that if one of the conclusions of this is that we should all be talking about it, then one of the things that I think is smart is that if anyone, regardless of gender, wants to challenge us on this, then they're welcome to, and that this will be a space in which they can do that, and for us to all to learn together, because fundamentally we want to drive towards the same thing. And if we're talking about raising standards in healthcare, especially within the corners that we can more easily influence, then maturity of conversation is super important to us, and that is something that needn't be, if people think we're defining the terms of that conversation, they're mistaken. We're saying all the cards on the table, right, Joe? I think I might have mentioned that once or twice before.
One or two times.
Well, thanks so much. We've just gone into overtime because it felt like it was worth doing, but I think we will wrap up there. Helen, thank you for your comment. Massive conversation, which needs to be kept going. Continue to talk about this subject has to be the way forward. And a kiss on there as well, Helen. Thanks, you.
Helen. Hello.
Appreciate that. Joe, this week really is the first noise about MeHab and MeHub. So tell folk about that before we wrap up.
Yes, so MeHab, my website went live today. Exciting. So MeHab is the home of all the stuff I'm doing on coaching and conversations around clinician well-being. So that's the main site, and from there you can access something called MeHub, which is a community. It only started this week, and there's been so much great conversation going on already. I'm really excited about it. So mehab.co.uk, and then from there you can get onto the MeHub community. So if you have any interest in getting involved in these conversations, I would love you to join me and others there.
And obviously, just to say that's obviously not just about this, and it's something
my particular rant this week.
It's about self-care and having thoughtful reflections on making sure that you get the most out of your life and how that works with professional and personal identity. It's definitely been an experience and something that I'm looking forward to contributing to the MeHub.
Can I just say, Jack, that in the context of today, men, you are very, very, very welcome on MeHub, and I want you in the conversation.
Yeah, I can vouch for that. Certainly, I've not been called out hard on there yet, so no, I don't think that's the case, and I can see that it's a very welcoming environment. So please do join us on there. But yeah, that'll do. And as I've said to you all week, guys, unfortunately, I can't play our usual outro graphics and stuff like that. So instead, what we do is I press end, and then me and Joe just awkwardly wave